Welcome. I'm so excited to be at Star Trek. This is so fun because I get to nerd out with people who actually know what I'm talking about. I go to dinner parties and it's not nearly as entertaining to talk to people about web technologies and stuff. So I'm pumped to be here. Thanks for coming. My name is Burton Smith. You can find me at Stuffbreaker on Twitter, Mastodon, Blue Sky, whatever you're on. I'm also on LinkedIn, but be advised there is another Burton Smith that used to work at Microsoft because I work at Microsoft. I'm not him. He has since passed away. So just for clarification that I'm not that guy in case you're wondering. So there are two Burton Smiths that worked at Microsoft, strangely enough. Not many of us out there. So and I, like I said, work at Microsoft. I work with web components every day, but I'm not like an evangelist or anything. I'm not trying to sell web components to anyone. I'm just super nerdy, and I like doing this stuff for fun. So I make web component-related apparel for myself so that I can talk to people about web components just because I really like them. They're really fun and really cool. So, and also, I was at the Blazor talk this morning, and I'm already scheming, oh, Blazor and web components together. This is really cool. I'm really excited about it. So, and I'll talk a little bit more about maybe what that'll entail in a little bit. But I just kind of wanted to talk about, how we're using web components at work at Microsoft, and what that means, and how that, how that's kind of helped us understand web components, and hopefully how that's helped the community understand web components a little bit better. So I'm just going to give a little story time. I hope you're ready for this. So right now, I work on a platform. It's called Partner Center. It's since been changed to various other names. So basically, it's the portal where people go to buy and sell bulk licenses of their Microsoft products, so like Xbox, Office 365, Windows, etc. It's also where people go and manage their app. If they have an app in the App Store, they can go in and manage it within the Sales and Partner portal there. Now, the Partner Center portal is built using this very fun architecture called micro front-end architecture. Anyone familiar with that? Load of chaos? Yeah, all right. So we have basically a choose-your-own-adventure kind of situation in Partner Center where everyone kind of does whatever they want in there, and hopefully it turns out okay, right? Well, I'm going to tell you that initially it didn't turn out very well, right? We had everyone doing their own micro front-end architecture, which means everyone was using their own technology, which means everyone's experience, or in their pillar within the environment, had its own kind of look and feel, experience, dialogues would behave inconsistently from one part of the application to another. Accessibility was not consistent across the application. It led to a lot of headaches throughout. And so they said, you know what, we need something like a design system. How many of you have heard of design systems before? Magic, right? Oh, design systems are so cool. Basically, design systems are a way of documenting and architecting your applications in a consistent way and in a scalable way. So they said, okay, let's get a design system in here for this Partner Center portal. Well, Microsoft has a design system. It used to be called Fabric. Now it's called Fluent. And we could have everyone use that. There's only one downside to that, is that it's only written in React. And so they were like, okay, management was like, that's okay. We'll just have everyone use React. And of course, that wasn't received exceptionally well, especially with the non-React developers, because obviously they chose the tech stack that they did because of either prior knowledge, preference, etc. So trying to then force them into a specific framework was not ideal. So then this idea was tossed around, well, what about this idea of web components? Web components are the standard. It's kind of been around for a little while. Why don't we give those a shot? So they went in and started investigating this. So for those of you who don't know, web components, this is from MDN. Web components are a suite of different technologies allowing you to create reusable custom elements with functionality encapsulated away from the rest of your code and utilize them in your web apps. So basically, it's your own way of creating your own HTML elements, right? The nice thing about that is that they are interoperable. They are framework agnostic, so you can plug and play them anywhere, ideally, right? So, that's appealing for this architecture. Now, there's just the question that comes up quite a bit. It's a little thing. You guys are welcome to scan that QR code. I'll actually save you a click here in a minute, but it's a website called Are Web Components a Thing Yet? So I'm just actually going to jump on over to that really quick. Oops, not that. There you go. There's your answer. And actually, if you scroll down on this site, it goes on to say, hey, web components are used by a lot of organizations. So if you go through and look through this list, there's some pretty notable names on here that use web components. Obviously Microsoft being amongst them. So yes, web components are a thing. They're being used, especially since IE 11 has kind of died, thank goodness. Anyone still rocking IE 11 support somewhere? I'm so sorry. I'm very sorry. Hey, I'm a Microsoft employee. Please tell everyone that IE is dead. It's no longer, unfortunately. Some situations require IE support still, and there's long-term support, et cetera. But since then, there has been the ability to start using web components more freely because IE was really the kind of holdout for web component support. Web components have been around since HTML5 rolled out. That was like one of the things of HTML5. They've been there for a while, and just now they're starting to get traction. So awesome. Yeah, web components are a thing, and we can use them now, right? We have a great support. Now, what does that entail? Now, web components are a concept. They're not actually a technology. They're a combination of 3 different technologies. We have custom elements, HTML templates, and Shadow DOM. We'll talk about each of those individually here. Now, custom elements is the ability literally to define your own HTML elements. So you can say, hey, browser, I want you to create a tag called my element that I can then use wherever I want to and plug and play it. So you define it using JavaScript, then you can plug and play your my tag element, as long as it's been registered, wherever you want in your application, because now it's kind of part of the browser spec, right? You've now upgraded the browser spec to use and recognize your custom element. Pretty awesome. Now, the other thing that we can do, now, one thing that I do want to clarify, let me back up just a second. These technologies, the thing that's really awesome about them is that they are completely independent of each other. You don't have to depend on one, and you don't have to use all 3 at the same time. You can use custom elements in one place. You can use HTML templates in another place, and Shadow DOM completely isolated. So they're not dependent on each other to create web components. So if there's something that you like or don't like about one of these technologies, you can opt out of it. Obviously you don't get the features from that, but they're not dependent if you want to create web components. So that's kind of something good to know. So now Shadow DOM, this is where a lot of people are like, this is the one I kind of want to opt out of, but because I was on that party initially, I was not a Shadow DOM fan. Shadow DOM is rad, okay? Let me tell you why. Shadow DOM gives you the ability to attach a sub-DOM tree outside of the flow of the regular DOM to any element that you want. So in our case, we use it with our custom elements that we've defined, but you can attach it to a span, you can attach it to a div, you can attach it to all these different elements. And what that does is that creates that sub-DOM tree that is now, again, outside of the flow of the rest of the DOM, which creates encapsulation. Now, this is really important for library authors so that you can create style encapsulation so that when people start creating styles, they don't affect your defined design system guidelines, right? Perfect example of what we ran into one time. I used to work on an e-commerce platform. That e-commerce platform was rocking a really weird mix of Angular 1.3 and jQuery. Yeah, I don't know why that happened, but it did. So one thing that we had is we had a team come in and they were working on a small piece of the e-commerce platform, and they brought in a jQuery plugin, and they said, okay, it's this select plugin to help provide better features and things for a select. So they went ahead and just selected all the select tags in there as the jQuery selector. And guess what? Their part of the site worked great, worked exactly the way they wanted to, but they broke the rest of the e-commerce platform because they selected all of the selects and broke them all inadvertently. So by adding things into an isolated shadow DOM, they exist outside of the flow of that and are not affected the same way. So they can't be selected by bare selectors using JavaScript query selectors. They also are outside the flow of CSS. So if they come in and decide to color all the buttons pink, it won't affect the buttons that are in your shadow DOM. It'll keep them isolated and keep that from being affected. Now, there are ways to get in there and change that if you want to open up the API to be like that. But this encapsulation is really cool because it helps protect your assets that you're building in your components. The other thing, too, is that it makes your application performant because content that gets rendered in the sub-DOM tree is isolated from the rest of the content, so it only worries about itself. So it helps keep the app, as things change, as styles change and things redraw, those only get redrawn and updated in your isolated shadow DOM, so it's very performant. It's awesome. So this is just kind of a quick anatomy of how this is using the Adobe Spectre field group, just a quick example. So that's their element, a field group. And then you'll see there's this node right there called hash shadow root. And that's the shadow DOM where those elements live in there. And so that's how they stay isolated from the rest of the application. But then we have these elements that get slotted in called checkboxes, and those live in the light DOM, so they can be styled in the light DOM. So you get this kind of language. We get the shadow DOM, which sounds mysterious and dark, and we get the light DOM and light tree. But it's really this way. The shadow DOM just means that it's in a shadow root, and it stays out of the flow of the rest of the DOM. So it's very useful. The other one that's used, that's available, but hasn't really had a lot of love lately, especially with the JavaScript tag templates or JavaScript template literals, is the idea of HTML templates. Now, HTML templates are a way of defining chunks of DOM that are inert. You can load them on a page, and then you can literally clone them and then stamp them out wherever you want to within the DOM. So the syntax looks like this. There's a template tag and has an ID. So you can literally say get element by ID, TEMPL, and then you could say .clone, and then you can clone that around wherever you want to. Now, the cool thing about this is that alert will never get executed until you actually add it to the DOM somewhere. So it'll be, it'll stay there. It won't do anything until you actually apply it to the DOM. Now, the reason why most people haven't done this is because it's kind of awkward that you have to include this inert DOM in the rest of your other DOM in order to get this to clone the rest of the way. Now, where we're starting to see a resurgence of the template tag is with this thing called declarative shadow DOM. Has anyone heard of declarative shadow DOM? Yeah, it's a way of defining the contents of your component declaratively so that you can do things like server-side rendering and things like that. So it's a new feature coming, a feature that's out, sorry. Declarative shadow DOM is available today where you can use the template tag to provide pre-rendered content for your DOM elements, which is pretty cool. Now, the other thing that we wanted to look at was custom elements everywhere. Now, I don't know why I put this slide right here the way I did, but we'll look at it anyway, just because custom elements everywhere is really cool. So, custom elements everywhere. This is the other thing that people have a lot of questions about is, hey, what's the support look like for this? If I want to use this in my React, Vue, Angular, whatever application, what's the support model look like? Can we plug and play it where we need to within our applications? And this is actually a suite of tests that are available to say, hey, here are the features that are available for custom elements or web components. How well are they supported in these different applications. So you can go through and see, oh, you know what, we're using Vue. Vue has tremendous support. So that's something that we can use and be confident that whatever we're building is going to be okay. Now, this report isn't here to like dissuade you from using a specific framework with yours. It's more about being knowledgeable about, hey, how do we build our components in a way so that they can accommodate either failing tests or shortcomings within these frameworks. So, for example, React is kind of the problem child right now with web components. We use wrappers for that. I'll talk more about that in a second. But with React 19 that's coming out, we finally get custom element support in there and web component support. So it looks pretty stellar right now. I'm very excited about it. That is in beta right now if anyone hasn't had a chance to play with it yet. So we're going to get very nice custom element support coming in React in the near future. So looking at our micro front-end architecture, it looks like, okay, we've got all the checkboxes checked. It looks like it looks good for the frameworks that we're using, and we have ways to, and the ones that aren't well supported, we have ways around the issues that are coming up in there. So that's great. So this is a great resource when you start building your web components to make sure that you're aware of any compatibility issues that might come up. Now, so far, everything looks really good with web components. There was a lot of questions that came up like, well, why shouldn't we use web components? Why are web components a good choice? And we started already seeing some good reasons for it, but why shouldn't we use them? The first one is server-side rendering. These run on the client, and when you register a custom element, they get registered on the window object. Well, when you server-side render something, there's no window object to assign these custom elements to, right? That is something that is actively being worked on. Like I said, declarative shadow DOM does provide a stopgap for this. There's also this really cool new way of creating custom elements called declarative custom elements, where you can literally create a custom element using HTML instead of having to use JavaScript. With declarative custom elements, you can define those, and they get registered, and they just in your markup like anything else, and you can use them with server-side rendering or however you like to apply your DOM elements. So this has so there's kind of a slanty smiley face because it's like kind of almost there, but not quite. So there's a workaround for it right now, but it's only going to get better here in the very near future. I've been working with the team on the spec for that, and it looks really cool. So the other one, search engine optimization. We heard a lot of people saying, hey, web components don't work with search engine optimization. Well, I'm happy to say that's not true. I actually personally have debunked that myth. I went through and wrote up an article on Dev2 about web components and SEO, and web components are SEO compatible. The elements within your shadow DOM, if you're using a shadow DOM, are completely visible for the indexer. So you can safely use these custom elements with the custom element content will be indexed by search engines. So win right there. We got it. Requires JavaScript. And that's, like I said, some people really, they're like, oh, do you know what? We need to be able to provide a way of providing our UI without JavaScript, right? If they turn off JavaScript, it still needs to work. Again, kind of slanty face, declarative shadow DOM and the declarative custom elements should provide a stopgap for that as well. But if you have more rich interactions that you want to be able to provide, JavaScript is kind of a requirement for that. So that is kind of a slanty smile right now. Browser spec adoption, and this is kind of with anything, right? The nice thing about frameworks is they oftentimes will kind of add new features ahead of when browsers have them. Well, because custom elements are part of the browser spec, they are subject to whatever the browser provides. There are polyfills and things available so that you can fill in those gaps if they do come up, but it'd be nice not to have to. So browser adoption, we're at the mercy of how fast browsers can release certain features. The good news is because there's so much hype around web components right now, browsers are really starting to giddy up around providing features and making sure there's a standard implementation for all browsers, which is great. Forms if you have a shadow DOM and those elements live in a shadow root, like your input elements, how is it supposed to be able to communicate with like form elements and things like that? Well, there's a new spec that came out last year, maybe a year before, called element internals, which allow your internal elements to communicate outside of your shadow root to things like form elements. So things like form validation and things work as you would expect with normal HTML elements. So forms, that was a concern, but it looks like that's working really well. It's been working well for a while. Legacy browsers. Really the last legacy browser that was struggling with a lot of this was IE11. Hopefully not many of you have to struggle with IE11 anymore, and now that that's gone, we can kind of move on. And the evergreen browsers have committed to good support for custom elements, so that's really good. Learning curve. This is probably one of the biggest ones, is that there is a learning curve when working with not only Shadow DOM, that's usually the one that people first get concerned about, but also custom elements in general. They work and operate differently than like a React component, because there's actually an element that gets registered on the page, and that element you can access the state of and access methods on and emits events, and you can pass in properties directly on the tag. So some people, once they've come from a JavaScript framework where that doesn't really exist, and now they're using these custom elements in the DOM, there's a little bit of a learning curve from that. Now, I will say that there are some really awesome, really nice things that come with that learning curve, because you're like, oh, this feature is kind of amazing because it helps us manage a lot of things that the framework's kind of struggled with. But again, there's a little bit of a learning curve with that. I'm personally trying to help reduce that learning curve by providing educational materials and tooling and things like that, but it does still exist. Component registries, and this is where things get interesting, because like I said, we're working in a micro front-end architecture. We have potentially different versions of our library being loaded at a given time. The downside to this is that you can only register one tag per session, per browser session. So if I have someone using my button version 2 and they load, but then someone comes in later with my button version 3, well, guess what? Because my button version 2 was loaded first, the people who tried to load my button version 3 are still going to be using version 2, because whoever loads first wins. That's the one that gets registered and gets used through the life cycle of the session. So because of this, we've had to implement scoping mechanisms so that we can say, hey, you are in the support, so we have my button support or my button help center or whatever, so that they have scoped buttons throughout the application. So that's something that's been kind of a downside with web components in the way that they're registered right now. Now, I will say there is a spec coming out called scoped element registries, so that scope custom element registries, so that you can scope them to a shadow DOM and make sure that there's they don't have to be reused throughout, so they don't have tag name collisions throughout the rest of the DOM. So there's some cool features coming with that. Unfortunately, it's not available yet, but that's just something to be aware of if you are building a micro front-end architecture. Now that I said, well, why not web components? Here's where web components really shine, and this is where we've seen a lot of opportunities with web components. The first one was, this was actually with a group that I was consulting with last year. They're on a Vue implementation, and they have their original product was written in Vue 1. They have a new product coming out in Vue 2, and they wrote a new application and their design system in Vue 3. The problem is their design system cannot be used in the Vue 1 and the Vue 2 implementation unless they rewrite it to be compatible with it. So this is where, even though like in our micro front-end architecture where we are using it across, the same application, here's where web components are also very useful within the same organization, but within separate products, right? Web components are version agnostic. They don't care what version of Vue you're using. They're run by the browser, not by the JavaScript library. So by moving their their component library to web components, they're able to now begin using their design system across all of these products, which is nice because it allows them to progressively enhance what they had in version 1, and so they can easily start to bump up to version 2 and version 3 if they need to, because they're having to rewrite less of their component library because they're using these reusable components. So that was a huge win for them. The other one that I've seen is with consulting groups. I would be shocked. I'd be surprised if consulting groups don't start creating their own white label component libraries so that they can show up and say, hey, we're going to build an application for you. We already have our own component library. We can easily spin that up, and we just flavor it and style it however is according to your brand, and allows us to more rapidly build applications for you, right? So being able to have this generic, reusable set of components that you can literally use anywhere is a huge, huge value add, right? You can accelerate your product development significantly by reducing the amount of reused code. So now with that being said, using components, this is something where we found a little bit of chafe when writing our components. When you start writing a component, the API, the native API, is interesting. So for example, it's class-based, so you create a class and you name it, whatever you want to, and you extend it from the HTML element, so you get all the native HTML behavior from your component. Then you go ahead and define a constructor and say, okay, this is what I want you to do when you boot up the component. You kick it off, and these are the initial values that you want. You can attach your shadow root, apply content into that shadow root if you want to. Then you go ahead and add this connected callback. So this is behavior. Once it connects to the DOM, these are the events that you want to fire so that it knows, okay, there's actually an element here now. The DOM is available. I can fire all these things. To add event listeners, et cetera, et cetera. Then you go through and say, okay, now I need to observe any attributes that get bound to my custom tag. So if there are any attributes that get bound, I want to be able to be notified of that, so then I can update my logic and my properties inside of it. Then you go through and you add all these getters and setter properties within your component to say, okay, now the properties updated. Let's make sure our internal class properties are in sync with whatever the user bound on the tag. All right, then you go through and say, okay, well, attribute change callback. Now, whenever those change again, we got to make sure we get everything back in sync all over again, right? And then you say, okay, now that we've done all that, window, custom elements.define, whatever my component is, and then bind it to the class that you created. So, with that being said, that's kind of a lot. The good news is that most people don't write it that way. Most people don't use the bare API spec for that, unless you're some kind of psychopath. I don't know, but most people don't do that. Thank goodness, right? Because that's kind of a lot to wrap your head around, a lot to try to keep in sync, and a lot to manage within the component. There's a lot of great tools out there that help us author our components in a much more concise and meaningful way. So there's a couple. These are libraries that sit on top of the spec that allow you to basically add custom tags or custom properties to your class element and manage your, almost like you would with another JavaScript library. You have properties that you define, and it keeps your attributes and your properties in sync and all of these things, and lifecycle hooks, and it's really nice. So this is nice because it's very close to the native API, but they add some really great features on top of it. Now, with that being said, there are also compilers. So these are ones where you write it in their syntax, and then they transform it into whatever the final product looks like. The nice thing about these is that there's a very clearly defined API. A lot of them are using tools that you're very comfortable with already, or syntaxes that you're comfortable with already, and they can compile down to the final output that's needed for the browser, even though you're probably not writing it in that way, right? So these are really nice tools. The downside that I've run into with compilers is that because they're a very defined, specific API, the amount you can do with them or the amount that you can extend them or modify them is a little more restricted, but you may want that. That might be a nice feature to you. Now, the other thing that is available is that a lot of the frameworks are now providing ways to compile their components down to web components. So you can author your components in Angular Elements. Anyone used Angular Elements before? Okay, and so you can write it in Angular syntax and have it compiled down to web components. Same thing with Vue. Vue has a new compiler where you can draft it in a Vue component, and then they have a custom method that says, turn this into a web component, and it'll do that for you. It's pretty cool. So if you're familiar with a certain kind of ergonomics, these tools make it very easy for you to transition to web component authoring, which is very nice. Now, just in case that wasn't enough, there is a site called webcomponents.dev. I highly recommend it. It's a sandbox environment. And actually, I can show you just briefly. Basically, it's a place where you can go. It's a playground where you can go try out all these different ways to create web components. And if you go click on one of them, it'll spin up a sandbox environment where you can go and start tinkering around with it and see like, oh, here's how you write, here's what the API looks like. Here's how things function. So it's kind of a fun little playground. If you're curious and you want to try it out, this is a very low stakes way to jump in there and start playing with web components. So I recommend checking it out if you're interested. So webcomponents.dev, super fun. All right. So the next part that we had to try to figure out is like, okay, we like the idea of web components. It seems like we can, we're aware of the shortcomings of web components. They seem to, we're able to work around them. We're able to provide stopgaps for them. Now, how do we make sure that we have a good integration experience for our web components? So one of the trickiest parts with this is each one of these environments is very different from each other in terms of the way they use components and use elements, right? So we've been working really hard on trying to find ways to provide a consistent experience with our custom elements. So right now, and we looked and saw like a lot of those reports were saying, hey, these have great support. Like Vue has great support for custom elements, right? The downside is that the moment you drop a custom element in those environments, you get nothing. It's just there. Yes, it works. Yes, it's available, but you don't get the same experience you get with a Vue component as you do with a custom element. So if I were writing a Vue component, I get all kinds of great like autocomplete information, syntax highlighting. I get type validation if I'm using TypeScript in those environments, right? I get a lot of really good experiences from using my custom elements in those environments. The challenge that we were running into is that people, yes, they worked, but people were like, but this is a lesser experience. Like we're missing out on goodness here. So my personal goal since I've been at Microsoft for about 2.5 years, has been to provide closing the gaps in these scenarios. So going through and saying, okay, in order for you to use custom elements in Preact, for example, they use JSX templating. What do we need to make sure that developers have a good experience and the right information and the right validation with their custom elements in these environments. And so I've started creating these packages that basically take the information that is provided by your custom elements and translate them into tools to help with this. So for example, so we have Stencil there on the bottom left, we have Solid.js, we have Preact. Those all use JSX templating, right? But they're not React templating. React has its own kind of behaviors and templating, but JSX is different, even though they still use the same kind of templating syntax, right? So, okay, we can provide JSX types for those environments so that you can get type validation, autocomplete, you can get text descriptions for attributes and properties and tag names and things like that. So now being able to take our information and auto-generate these tools for teams so that they can provide meaningful experiences for these different frameworks has been a critical piece in providing good adoption, right? Now teams, in some ways, we can provide better tooling experiences than what the framework can provide because we found ways to include different types of context. So, different descriptions and things like that. One of the things that's coming soon, I'm very excited about, I'm going to spill the beans just a little bit, even though it's not available yet, is an HTML linter. So that if you're in like .NET or if you're writing static sites or whatever it is, or just vanilla HTML, there's no way to validate, like at least with JavaScript, you can validate what goes into those templates, right? Because they're using JavaScript to validate it. Static HTML doesn't really have a good validation experience. So we have an HTML linter that will actually go through and lint your HTML and say, hey, that tag is deprecated, or that attribute is deprecated, you need to use this other attribute, or you're not using an appropriate attribute value for that. So if we have predefined values, like for button appearance, right? We can say our appearance equals brand, hollow, static, whatever it is. If we have predefined values for an attribute, we can actually go through and say, you're not using the right attribute there, attribute value, and it's not going to work properly. This is really nice, right? That way teams, not only as they use them, get the right information, but also as they upgrade to new versions of your library, can get real-time feedback. Oh, that was deprecated, it's not there anymore. You need to start using this new property now. So we have a lot more power now with what we can communicate to our developers as they're using our custom elements, which is really cool. So coming soon. I know it's not ready yet. I'm sorry. I know you're excited, but I'm excited, and it's coming very, very, very soon. The other one, does everyone know what the bottom right icon is right over there? Storybook. Yeah, anyone using Storybook right now for their component authoring? Storybook is an incredibly powerful tool if you're not using it already for creating isolated development environments for your components. So if you want to be able to create components and create an environment where you can really take that out of the rest of the application. I remember before Storybook, what did we do for testing components in isolation? We create an index.html file. We add the component there, add test to it, and then as soon as we're done, delete it, and then the next person would come along and do the same thing, and we troubleshoot it that way, right? It was such a headache. Now with Storybook, we can create these stories where it's like, hey, here's my component, and here's a certain scenario with that component, and those can stay with the code as teams, go through and start iterating over the component development. And you don't have to delete it every time. You can reuse it from team to team. But also, you can configure it so that you have these cool things called controls. They used to be called knobs, where they were your property values. And you can select them in the UI and see how it affects your component. It's really cool. Well, we have an integration tool that takes our information from our components, translates that into Storybook configuration data, and renders the component and all of your controls correctly in there. So you don't have to do all this manual wire up to say, okay, this control maps to this property, this control maps to that property. It just does it automatically for you. So you get that built out. There's not a ton of developer work that has to happen. The other nice thing too is that it keeps them in sync. So if you just change a value on your component, it'll update the control, and vice versa. It'll keep those in sync so that you can always see what happens when certain properties and configurations change on your component. So big plug for Storybook. If you haven't used it already, I highly recommend looking it up and trying to implement it in your environment. Okay. Now, this next slide is something that I have learned the hard way, okay? The hardest part about building with web components is learning everyone else's framework. And the reason why I say that, and this is something that I didn't think would happen. So I started getting into web components. I started with Angular, Vue, went into web components, and I tried React for a while, and I was like, I don't know if it's for me. Well, guess where I spend a lot of my time right now? React. All right, that's what I was like, oh, sweet, I can build web components and use them everywhere. I don't have to use React. Well, I spend a ton of time with React because I'm educating teams on how to use our components in React, and how to use our components in Angular, and how to use our components in Svelte. We spend a lot of time, my team spends a lot of time on the education aspect of it and communicating like, oh, hey, here's, it's not as scary as you think. You guys can use these custom elements, and, we help do a lot of coaching on it. But the amount of information that I've had to learn to make sure that I can help provide them good support of other frameworks surprised me. I never thought that I would be in that situation working with a framework agnostic component library. So that's just a little heads up for you. If you're not already savvy on some of the tools that your teams are using that would be consuming this, it will be helpful to become familiar with that, at the very least on the super high level templating level, and also on the integration level, and being aware of what that looks like for custom elements. So just a little heads up on that. Now, one thing that I did talk about is that the tooling available for providing better integrations. Like I said, I've built quite a few of them myself. We have integration tools for React Wrappers. We have JSX tools, Solid.js tools, et cetera, et cetera. I wanted to make sure you guys had a link to that in case you are curious about what kind of integrations are available if you want to start integrating your components and having a good experience, a similar or comparable experience with custom elements in their framework environments. This is a link to my GitHub where I have most of them listed in there, so you're welcome to check those out and use those to your heart's desire. The other link that I wanted to provide you before I continue on was a link to the Web Component Storybook helpers. So I've created a set of helpers to help integrate web components into Storybook if you are using Storybook. This is a helpful tool to help smooth out the experience with custom elements in Storybook. So check that out. All right, and then back into our story. Okay, cool. All right, so we talked about our partner-centered experience. We have this micro-front-end architecture. Everyone's using their own thing. Going with React wasn't a good choice, and trying to use the design system there. So that's where our web component library came in. What's called Harmony. We built it on web components. It's kind of like based on the Fluent spec, but it kind of has its own flavor to our partner-centered experience. So it's custom for that. But it allows teams to provide that consistent user experience across each of those silos, right? They're all using the same buttons, dialogues, fly-in panels, whatever it is they need. They're all consistent, which means not only do our users have a consistent experience, but also we have consistent accessibility and quality in the components that are being implemented. We have a very complex grading standard for accessibility at Microsoft. But the nice thing is that as they come in and test our components and give us feedback on that, as we fix those and propagate them, everyone else gets the benefit of those fixes and upgrades. So it's been very, very good to ensure code quality and accessibility consistency throughout our application. Now, this has kind of been successful. So now we have moved on to not just Partner Center, we're now traversing multiple platforms within Microsoft, which is great. And something that's been a recent development in the last year is, more and more parts of Microsoft as a whole are kind of filling the same pain points that we were running into. They had a design system that was kind of like a bootstrap-based design system where, they were applying classes and had jQuery functions and things to help manage things. They realized that that's not super scalable or upgradable as they would like. We had other teams that were React only, but now they're running into situations where they need to support Vue and Angular and .NET. Okay, so it seems like web components might be a good thing for them. So more and more, we had these parts of the organization coming in and saying, "Hey, we kind of want what you got. Like, we really like what Harmony's doing over here, and we have ambition to have our own thing, but it's we want Harmony, but we kind of don't want Harmony. We want what you have, and we like the idea of what you have, but we want it in our own way. We don't really want the same behavior and styles that are coming out with that." So we've last year kicked off an initiative called Project Charm. And it's kind of a weird play on names because it's two teams. We're the Harmony team. The other team is the Coherence team. So we're now the Charm team. So the Project Charm is basically this initiative where we are taking what we had in Harmony and we're distilling it down to unstyled, boring, unflavored components. But it still has all of the same functionality and accessibility capabilities. But they're generic. They're not used for. They don't have any kind of theme applied to them or anything. And so what this is that we have some teams in Microsoft who want the Fluent design system. We have some teams in Microsoft who don't want the Fluent design system. They have their own. And so we want them to have the ability to plug and play this core library without having to recreate the wheel every time, right? Whenever they want to create a new design system, we don't want them to have to start from scratch and try to build up from there and try to figure out, how do I tie all this together and what's the project architecture look like? So we're building this core project so that they can build and extend off of it and customize it however they need to. So now for us, we have this, and then now we've extended it and built a Fluent theme on top of that. From that Fluent team, we were able to build and extend our Harmony theme off of it. So now, not only are we leveraging the latest and greatest from the Fluent team in terms of design, but also other teams can take advantage of that too without having to use the Harmony styles and themes. They can, if they want to build off of the Fluent aspect of it, they can, right? It's very extensible and very themable to meet whatever their needs are. But again, it still has that core goodness of accessibility and behavior that you'd want from your component library. So with that being said, so we started this last year, and then we saw this article come out from this random dude called Brad Frost. Have you guys ever heard of Brad Frost? Yeah, I say random dude, but he's kind of a big deal. He wrote an article about having a core design system or a global design system so that you could you're not having to do exactly what I said, start from scratch. Every time you want to start up a component library, you could have this core set of design systems and then extend and customize it however you wanted to. So with that being said, we were like, that's exactly what we're trying to do. Like, it's awesome that there's other parts of the development world that also are feeling the pain points that we are and want to be able to do this. So with that being said, we are building this internally, but we have very near future plans to open source this so that if you are looking to build your own component library, you can leverage Charm. The name will probably change before it goes open source, but this is something that will be coming hopefully in the near future, next couple of months, that teams will be able to use and leverage if they want to build their own component library so they don't have to start from scratch. So we're very excited about that. And so if you want to follow me, you're welcome to follow me. And I'm sure I will be very loud and proud about it when it comes out, because I'll be like, oh my gosh, it's ready. Here it is. And it's kind of my baby right now. So so keep an eye on that if you're interested in that. With that being said, I wanted to make sure I saved some time for any questions about working with web components and scaling UIs with web components. You're welcome to add them to the Discord as well if you don't want to speak loudly. Otherwise, feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. Yes? Ooh, does the use of web components mean that you need to use the shadow DOM? And the answer is no, you don't have to. You can use custom elements separate from shadow DOM. So if you want just the custom tag and the custom behavior and all of that and the state management, you don't have to use shadow DOM to do that. You could use shadow DOM on a span if you wanted to. It can go anywhere. Mm-hmm.
Do you have thoughts on Shadow DOM and event hooks or hurts accessibility, or does it matter because accessibility tree?
So the question is, does Shadow DOM hurt or help accessibility? That is a good question. It's some ways it hurts it, some ways it's fine, right? The accessibility object model traverses the shadow DOM. So if you have nested elements in there, like if you have a list element and you have, a list element and then list items, it will see the list items in the shadow DOM if you want to. So it does see the accessibility object model in the shadow DOM. And so they can correlate with each other. Now, where there is some challenges with shadow DOM is that because there is isolation of the DOM in the light DOM and the shadow DOM, IDs and things like that don't see each other, right? So I could have an ID in my shadow DOM and the same ID in the light DOM, and they're completely isolated from each other. They're unaware of it. That becomes a problem when you're trying to associate things together to say like aria described by or aria labeled by, and if they're in different DOM trees and they can't see each other, that doesn't work. Now there are ways around that. There are ways to implement it so that they still can see each other. But there's also a new spec coming out very, very soon called the Cross-Route Aria. Cross-Route Aria is now this new proposal where you can pass IDs and things back and forth between the shadow DOM so they can see each other. So that's going to be amazing. So that's coming soon. But yes, there are some accessibility considerations that you have to make when composing your components to make sure that accessibility is met.
Real quick, sorry. I asked because we ran into a situation where there was a nesting problem.
Mm-hmm.
I work in an accessibility company, and we would find a shadow element, and then it could have its own element, and it could have a shadow element.
Mm-hmm.
So we had to keep going.
Yeah.
And that was not, it was like tough to figure that out.
Ooh, I have a trick I can help you with. Come see me afterwards. I'll show you how we traverse or at least inspect the accessibility object model so that we can troubleshoot those kind of problems. Yeah, good question. So he's saying that he has a situation where there are multiple nested components, and trying to figure out accessibility issues with all these shadow DOM layers can be very tricky. There are ways around that, and there are good tools available, especially in Chromium-based browsers, to help troubleshoot that. And so anyone who wants to see that, come see me. I'll try to point that out. Yes.
You mentioned React. Does this work in any mobile, like React Native or anything like that?
The question is does this work in mobile frameworks like React Native? That's a good question. I don't know if I've ever tried to do that. I'm sure there's documentation on that. The tricky part with React Native, if I recall correctly, is that sometimes there's a bit of a compiler step or a translation step with some of that where it'll translate the DOM elements to native elements, and so that might get tricky. Now, I do know that other frameworks like Ionic is basically a web-based mobile development platform. They are web components based. They actually created the Stencil framework so that you can author web components. That's what they use to build their component library. So if you're using a mobile platform, there are definitely ones out there that do work with it, but I've personally ever tried it with React Native. That's a really good question, though. Yes?
I'm curious more about like the unit testing side of things, especially like I'm familiar with testing library and wondering how compatible that would be with the Shadow DOM. I'm curious from somebody who maybe be designing these components, just these, test those in isolation, versus somebody who's testing like a module that uses those web components.
Yeah, super good question. All right, the question is, for someone who's testing these or writing unit tests for web components or writing tests for environments that use web components, what tools are available out there? Now, there are a couple things that we've done because we have both scenarios, right? We write our own unit tests for our components, making sure that they work correctly and behave the way they should. There are testing tools out there. OpenWC has a lot of great tools for testing your components. They even have one that's an extension, an Axe extension, so you can literally say my element dot is accessible, and it'll check to see if your component is accessible in a given state. It's super nice, super convenient, and we use those to test our components and the internals of our components. Now, one approach that we have recommended for our teams is that when using and testing your environments that use web components, avoid trying to test the internals of our components, right? They should treat them like HTML elements, not like components with sub-DOM trees that they then have to dive into. What they should do is test our components and the APIs of our components as they interact with their environment, not testing the behavior of our components as values get set. Because that's our job, right? As component authors, our job is to make sure that as you set certain API values a certain way, that they behave the way they should. That's our job. Their job is really to make sure their application and users can use things the way they need to. Now, there are tools out there if you do need to traverse the shadow DOM to dig into the internals to grab a reference to something. There's an extension, there's a tool for testing library that can help traverse the shadow DOM, written by one of my former coworkers, Connor. There's also a tool in Playwright, if you're using Playwright, that is available that helps traverse shadow DOM. A lot more of these tools are coming out with better features for shadow DOM traversal if you need to. So yeah, it's available. There are ways to do it. But again, when we recommend for our teams to test it, you don't need to dig into the internals of our component to test the behavior of that. Test your component, test your logic that you're using with our component. And that's been pretty good advice. Treat our components kind of like a black box kind of. So does that answer your question?
It's sort. I just know I'm coming from the testing library kind of point of
Sure.
view, so I'm not trying to test the internals of your component.
Yeah.
I agree with you, that's bad practice.
Mm-hmm.
But there are times in testing library where you need to get the input so you can manipulate it. You can't do that on a custom element. The testing library doesn't understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine.
There are you can like you can get by role and label and things like that, but there are also again that library is available so you can traverse the shadow DOM if you want to and say, hey, look into the shadow DOM for these elements if you want to. So it's definitely possible.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yes. Shoelace. Okay. Just the library shoelace.
And other libraries.
Okay. So Shoelace is, for those of you who don't know, is a web component library, kind of like Bootstrap. And actually, Shoelace is a play on Bootstrap. Shoelace, Bootstrap, And so it is a web component-based library as an alternative to Bootstrap so that you could have web components and author with web components. It's a very good tool. Corey Leviska is the creator of it. Connor, who I just mentioned, also works on that team. They both used to work with me at Microsoft. Corey recruited me to Microsoft. And so I've actually done contributions to Shoelace. I help with their Vue.js implementation and things like that. So it's a very cool library. It's also becoming web awesome. Anyone familiar with Font Awesome? Yeah, there's an icon library. Well, they acquired Shoelace last year, 2 years ago, and that's where Connor and Corey went. Is they left us to go work on Shoelace. I guess that's cool. But so they went and they're working on that, and now they're like, okay, let's take this to the next level. We now have they just finished a very successful Kickstarter. I think they got over $700,000 for the Web Awesome project. And so now that is going to be the next iteration of Shoelace. So these tools are really cool to help you get up and running and building applications, and especially if you have a small team that doesn't have a lot of bandwidth to create your own component library, because they're very customizable and very reusable, right? I highly recommend it. Now, if you're building your own, Shoelace is a great reference on how to author components. They do a very good job in there on how to build and scale your components and provide meaningful APIs for them. So I recommend taking a look at that as a reference if you're building your own web component library, because they do a fantastic job. Cool. Yes?
Why is your domain called Break Stuff?
Why is my domain called Break Stuff?
I know this is unrelated, but I have to ask.
Yeah, because I like to break things. I like to take things that work in a specific way and try to find a different way to do it. I like to take, especially if someone says, you can't really do that. Oh man, that's like fuel to the fire, right? I'm going to find a way to do it. I'm going to break a lot of stuff probably in the process, but I'm going to make it work. So a perfect example, actually. So I create, a lot of integration tools for web components. Blazor is the next on my list. And someone told me that you can't do it. And I'm like, oh, hold my beer. Here we go. Like, this is going down. So that's my next ambition, is to try to tackle Blazor and see if we can create some Blazor wrappers around our web components so you can plug and play your web components and use them just like Blazor components. So hopefully coming soon. Keep an eye out for that.